Hello and welcome to the Week 10 problem solving session for the NPTEL course on Environmental Impact Assessment. This course is being taught by Dr. Harshish Roshan Lakra, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. And I'm Isha Rathod, PMRF and Research Scholar at Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. Another session is usually taken by Miss Monica S. on Tuesdays, who's another PMRF and Research Scholar at Department of Architecture and Regional Planning at IIT Kharagpur. So a few housekeeping rules. Please mute yourself for the session. If you have any questions or you have answers, you can post them in the chat box. I will moderate the chat box and address the questions and answers as and when received, or you can raise your hands or unmute yourself for asking questions when I uh, stop for the questions and queries from your end. So, the outline of the session is that we're going to talk about the highlights from each week. That is, we're going to look up at the key takeaways from each of the lecture unit. And we're also going to look up at assignment questions from the previous run of the NPTEL course and their solutions to the assignment problems. And we will also look up at assignment 10 for week 10 as the deadline for the same has passed with the solutions to them. And if we received any queries from you, we will also clarify those queries uh, based on the week 10's content. So if you have any queries, you can post them in the discussion forums. So week 10 was about decision making and project management. And now we're going to dive into the highlights from week 10. So lecture 46 talked about AIA methods for landscape and visuals. So here we looked up at the concepts and definitions of relating to landscape and visuals. So landscape is defined as a zone or areas perceived by local people or visitors whose visual features and character are the result of action of natural and or cultural, that is human factors. And this definition was given by the European Landscape Convention in Florence on 20th October 2000. Uh, Year 2000. And so any zone or area which have visible or distinct features or characteristics because of the natural processes or because of human interventions or cultural development is defined as a landscape of that area. And there are several factors which contribute to landscape, and these there can be three categories for these factors. So it can be natural factor, cultural or social factor, or perceptual and aesthetic factor. So natural factors include geology, landform, hydrology, air and climate, soils, land cover, flora and fauna. So all of these are natural factors which are existing on a site because of its natural settings. And then cultural social factors include land use, settlements, enclosure, land ownership, time depth. So these are factors which determine the evolution of the landscape over the period of time. And then perceptual and aesthetic factors include sight, the color, textures, pattern, form, the sounds in that landscape, smells, touch or feel, preferences, associations, and memories associated to a particular landscape. So those are perception and aesthetics, and these can be different for different people and how they perceive the landscape. So these are the three categories of factors which contribute to the landscape. And then landscape characters defined as a distinct, recognizable, and consistent pattern of elements in the landscape that makes one landscape different from another rather than better or worse. So any characteristics which any distinct or recognizable pattern or characteristics which makes landscape differ from each other is known as a landscape character. And these can include factors like landform, geology, soils, water body and catchment areas, trees and woodlands, boundary features and patterns, agriculture, habitat and species, what type of crops grow in that particular land, what sort of habitats exist, what sort of species are present in a particular land. So these can be used to determine uh, these can be differentiating landscape characters. Others include settlement and development patterns, historic sites and features, recreational, access and experimental qualities, etc. And then there's a possible criteria for capturing visual character. So these are complexity, coherence, disturbance, stewardship, imageability, visual scale, and naturalness. So these are criteria for capturing the visual aspect or visual side of a landscape character. And then we also looked up at a multi-dimensional approach to landscape, and these can be defined based on landscape quality. So landscape qualities can be static or dynamic. So static are qualities which do not change over time, and dynamic qualities change over time. So we have type A, which is static spatial. So these are basic. These are These are qualities which put an emphasis on the physical landscape. Then we have type B, which is dynamic spatial. So these put emphasis on the interactions between the forms, relationship, and practices at any point of time. So any sort of interaction between characters or qualities present on the landscape on the site is a dynamic spatial type. And then type C is static temporal, which puts emphasis on the historic associations of the landscape, which is the past, how the past landscape has evolved. And then type D, dynamic temporal, puts an emphasis on interactions between forms, relationships, and practices over time. So these are the four types of dynamic landscape qualities. And then type E, which is dynamic spatial temporal, it puts the emphasis on the interaction between the forms, relationship, and practices over space and over time. So over both the two qualities. And then we look up at methods to capture the dynamic quality. So these can be cultural mapping and ecological system. So you can map. So these are basically type B from our previous discussion. And then historic accounts and mapping is type C, where we looked up at the historic landscape character over the area is type C. And then landscape histories and other accounts that trace people, place, interaction over time is type D. And the ecosystem services approach, which provides a good approach to assessment of all aspects of landscape, including these services. So these are examples for that. Then we look up at further definitions of relating to landscape and visual aspect. So landscape value is defined as the relative value that is attached to different landscapes by society. And second. And then landscape quality is defined as a measure of the physical state of the landscape. And this can include the extent to which typical characters are represented in the individual areas and the intactness of the landscape and the condition of individual elements. So basically the quality of the landscape and its characteristics. And then visual amenity is defined as the overall pleasantness of the views people enjoy of their surroundings, which provide an attractive visual setting or backdrop for the enjoyment of activities of the people living, working, recreating, visiting, or traveling through an area. So any sort of visual pleasantness which people experience when they come across this landscape is known as its visual amenity, and how pleasant or how attractive they find it to be. And then the other aspect which we looked up in this module was the scoping and baseline studies. So the landscape and visual assessment has stages include mapping of areas in which landscape and visual effects, receptors or receptor groups are present. So receptors are basically people who will experience the effect of any sort of development happening in the area. So these include human beings or communities living in that area, the flora fauna of that area. So those are the receptors. And then we also need to uh, map it proportional to the scale and nature, and look up at significant effects based on the type of activity or the reason for doing EIA. And then there's also this zone of theoretical visibility or ZTV. So this is used to describe the area over which a development can be theoretically seen. And this is usually done using a digital terrain model or a DTM or a digital surface model DSM. So both of these are computer generated models But a DTM, or the digital terrain model, is a 3D computer model of the Earth's surface within any surface objects. So basically, you make a 3D model of the you make a 3D model of the surface of the surface object. And a DSM is a digital surface model, which is again a computer generated model that represents the surface height, including the trees and buildings. And the ZTV is also sometimes known as a zone of visual influence or of visual envelope map. And the extent of visibility will also depend on the size and prominence of the development being considered. So basically, the zone of theoretical visibility is mapped using computer models, and this is done to establish the what sort of how the area will be perceived once development has taken place, including mapping all of the trees and surface heights and the building heights in it, as well as mapping the surface objects, the landform of the site. So that is the ZTV. And then for doing a landscape baseline, the purpose is to identify and evaluate the existing landscape of the site and surrounding area. And this includes individual elements that make up the landscape characteristics, and the landscape character. So this is why we do landscape baseline studies. And the baseline study covers things like the physical influences, aesthetic and perceptual aspects, historic landscape character assessments, desktop information or desk-based studies, and then baseline analysis, analyzing existing documents available relating to the landscape of the site, maps of current and historical development of the area, aerial photographs, and other photos. So these are all things which we include for doing a baseline study. And then in scoping and baseline, we also do participative or consultative techniques. So these involves asking people about how they use and perceive the landscape, and this can help identify the qualities of landscape that are important to those communities for whom landscape is a lived-in experience, particularly indigenous communities. And then we have consideration for evaluation of landscape sensitivity. And this looks up at the susceptibility of landscape to change. That is how likely is the landscape to change over a period of time, and the value of landscape receptor, that is the value which the users of that landscape assign to it. So these are two factors which we consider when we evaluate the sensitivity of landscape. And then visual baseline is done to identify and evaluate the existing visual relationships between the site and its surrounding area. And this is done to identify representative viewpoints and key sensitive viewers. And these typically include representative viewpoints, specific viewpoints, and illustrative viewpoints. So basically, visual baseline is done for identifying identifying how the visual aspect of the landscape is going to change because of the new development or new interventions to the site. And this is also done to identify how the receptors of the site will have how the receptors of the site will have the how the receptors of the site will perceive these developments visually. So this is the reason why visual baseline is done. And then we also looked at impact prediction and evaluation, that is assessing landscape effects. So again, there's a scale of change, and this is based on the change in character and the change in landscape elements and quality of the landscape. So if there's an obvious change, the scale of change is large, and you need to do mitigation efforts to make that scale of change small or imperceptible. And then we also have then the medium scale of change is when you have a discernible change in the landscape element. That is, you can see that there's a change occurring, but it is not a very obvious change. And then the small changes when you have a minor change in the landscape element or characteristics or the quality of the landscape, and imperceptible or no changes when you do not see any change in the landscape elements, character or uh, quality of the landscape. And then similarly, you have the definition of scale for visual change, which is again if the development has a very defining influence on the views and it becomes a key focus in that landscape, then it's a large scale of change. If it's clearly visible, but it forms are also an important element of the view, it's a medium scale of change. And if the development is visible but forms a minor element of the view, it's a small scale of change. And if there's no perceptible change in view, it's a imperceptible or no change scale of visual change. Then we also have, then we move on to lecture 47, which is on EIA methods on cultural heritage. So the purpose, they talked about the purpose of doing cultural heritage for projects, especially in the EIA assessment. So this is basically done for the historical and physical assessment, and the purpose is to provide information about the impacts of development on cultural heritage and to make these impacts available to the decision makers to allow appropriate mitigation and investment. So these are basically done for areas which have a very significant cultural uh, heritage value associated with it. So when you have a cultural value associated with the site, uh, and then the cultural heritage assessment is done to protect the cultural heritage from adverse effects of project activities and support its preservations, and to promote equitable sharing of benefits from the use of cultural heritage. So again, these are done where cultural heritage is a very significant part of the identity of a particular site. So in those cases, if you are doing any sort of development in such areas, you need to do a cultural heritage assessment in your EIA to demonstrate the effects of how the site or how your development actions are going to affect the perception of cultural heritage by the different receptors of the site, and what sort of mitigation efforts you are taking for reducing the adverse effects of these of the development on the cultural heritage. And then, so the World Bank Environment and Social Standard, that is ESS 8, defines the purpose of cultural heritage assessment as to address the cultural heritage as an integral aspect of sustainable development and to promote meaningful consultant with stakeholders regarding the cultural heritage. So this is again from the definition of another source. And then we look up at the definition of cultural heritage itself. So UNESCO in 1982 defined cultural heritage as the whole complex of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features that characterize a community, society, or social group. And the World Bank in 1994 defined cultural heritage as the present manifestation of the human past. So anything which is related to the human past and how it is perceived today. And it defined two dimensions to cultural heritage. So first is the tangible heritage, which is heritage that is physical, touchable, and perceptible. And the second is intangible heritage, which is a heritage that is not physical or represented by a physical object and is of a value not precisely measurable. So tangible heritage includes things like monuments, artifacts, and other things which you can touch, which have a physical form and which are present. Whereas intangible heritage is the sort of heritage which is not present in a physical form, but it is assigned a value. So things like stories which are passed on from one generation to another generation. So those are examples of intangible heritage. And yeah, so tangible cultural heritage includes archaeological remains, both above or below ground. These includes buried remains as well as standing buildings and archaeological sites as well as individual objects and artifacts. So all of these are tangible cultural heritage which you can touch and physically feel and see. And The UNESCO then defined the intangible cultural heritage, meaning practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewithin that communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. And these include oral traditions and expressions, including the language as a vehicle of the intangible cultural heritage, performing arts, social practices, rituals, and festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, including traditional medicines, traditional craftsmanship. So, all of these are intangible cultural heritage dimensions or examples. And then we also looked up at so we have discussed the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this is also uh, so we are also talking about this in cultural heritage because it talked about the role of biological resources in cultural heritage. So as part of the Convention on Biological Diversity of 1992, the parties which signed this convention or CBD, they to agreed to have to respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge, innovation, and practices of indigenous and local communities, embodying their traditional lifestyle, which is relevant to conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and promote their wider application with the approval involvements of holders of such knowledge. So basically, they agreed to share these to preserve first the country's own indigenous and local cultural heritage, and then share this information with the other countries or signatories to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And then the scope of cultural study includes temporal scope, wherein you look up at the past, present, and future of the site in terms of a cultural perception. And then you also look up at a geographical scale, that is in terms of what sort of uh, how geology affects this cultural definition. So then you can have something like terrestrial. So you have different types of habitats or geographical conditions like terrestrial, coastal, marine environments. So you look up at that geography as well as you look up at the temporal scope of the study site. And setting of a cultural heritage. So this is done in surroundings in which a place has experience while embracing an understanding of perceptible evidence of past in the present landscape. So when you have a knowledge that the site has a past, that is when you do cultural heritage. And so the ICOMOS 2005 also has a definition for cultural heritage, which is the immediate and extended environment that is part of or contributes to its significance and distinctive character. So of course, cultural heritage does not have a physical boundary unless it's present as a tangible cultural object. In case of intangible meaning associated to a site, uh, so you need to define the environment and be very sensitive in defining cultural heritage in your project definitions for EIA assessments. Then the consideration and understanding and analyzing the setting for cultural heritage. So this is so you can use a multidisciplinary approach where you seek inputs from experts in the local community and their perception of cultural heritage and how they associate your particular project site with cultural heritage. And then you review existing information which is available in the forms of formal records with the municipality, or if any mention of your site is being made in any literary context or book or any record. So you look up at that information as well. And then if based on your discussions with experts in local communities, you come across oral traditions and traditional knowledge systems, then you record that as well as the artistic and literary descriptions. So this is how you assess cultural heritage for your site. Then we looked up at the definition of landscape in the previous module. So now we will look up at historic urban landscape. So this is defined. as an urban area, which is understood as a result of a historical layering of cultural and natural values and attributes, extending beyond the notion of historic center or ensemble to include the broader urban context and its geographical setting. And this includes site topography, geomorphology, hydrology, and natural features. And this also includes social and cultural practices and values, economic processes, and the intangible dimensions of heritage, which are related to diversity and identification. So, historic urban landscapes basically includes landscapes like landscape characteristics like topography, geomorphology, hydrology, and natural features. So it includes all of those things as well as the cultural. So you can understand it as overlaying two layers. So the first layer is the historical layer, which talks about the cultural and natural and historic value of the site, and the second layer is the landscape of the site. And then when both of these layers are merged and look at together, that is the historic urban landscape. And so this definition is based on the recommendation on the historic urban landscape defined by UNESCO in 2011. Uh, So this is an example of historic landscapes based on the United States National Park Service. So this includes historic landscapes in the U.S. National Park Service, includes residential gardens, community parks, scenic highways, rural communities, institutional grounds, cemeteries, battlefields, zoological gardens. So all of these are included as historic landscapes, and they are composed of a number of character-defining features which individually or collectively contribute to the landscape physical appearance as they have evolved over time. So this is just an example of historical landscapes from a US point of view. And then the ICOMOS also has the NARA document on authenticity, which they passed in 1994. And they defined authenticity or the originality of the cultural heritage or the value we assign to cultural heritage. And this is based on a number of factors, including form and design, materials and substances used, the use and function of the object, monument, or artifact, traditions, techniques, and management systems, the location and setting, language, and other forms of intangible heritage, the spirit and feeling or the perception, and other internal and external factors. So these factors are used for assessing the authenticity of the cultural heritage or the value we associate with the cultural heritage. And these then influence the sort of mitigation efforts or protection or conservation efforts we need to do towards our sites. And consideration for assessing integrity of World Heritage properties. And this is given by the World Heritage Operational Guidelines of 2013. So this extends to properties which have all elements necessary to express its outstanding universal value and is of adequate size to ensure complete representation of features and processes which convey the property's significance. And it suffers from adverse effect of development and or neglect. So this is basically in case of properties where you have so you have to do cultural heritage as per the World Heritage Operation Guidelines. If the property or the site which you are developing has elements which have outstanding universal value in terms of their cultural aspect, and if the size and scale of the project is big enough, and if the property significance is high, and it is going to suffer from adverse effects of development and or neglect. So in those cases, you map the cultural heritage for your EIA side of cultural heritage. The purpose of integrity is to maintain the physical fabric or the of the property and significant features in good condition, and the protection of key elements to retain its total value, and the maintenance of relationships and dynamic functions of the property. So basically, integrity in terms of cultural heritage is defined as having like a seamless flow of cultural heritage. That is, if you make any sort of development or changes to the site, it does not change the overall character of the site. So, for example, if you have so, for example, if you take the example of the city of Jaipur, so it's known as the pink city. And if you suddenly make a development which has, let's say, a blue color, it's going to create a sort of disintegration. So you would not, in the pink city, if you make like a blue building, it's going to feel very different. It's going to have a significant impact on the perception of how people feel about the city with a blue building in between. So that is what we mean by integrity. That is, it should have like a seamless flow, or it should maintain the physical fabric of the entire site. And then we also looked up at critical cultural resources. So these include natural areas with cultural and or spiritual value, such as sacred groves, sacred bodies of water and waterways, sacred trees, and sacred rocks. So these are critical cultural resources which communities identify as sacred, and which they do not even allow access to outsiders beyond their community, or and in certain cases to different genders as well. And then it also includes natural areas with cultural value, which are equivalent to priority ecosystem cultural services, which is defined in the Performance Standard 6. And then we also look up at cultural heritage stakeholders. So, stakeholders are people who are going to be affected if any change in cultural heritage is observed. So, type of stakeholders include public authorities, national, federal, state, region, or local. So, these stakeholders include like cultural heritage authorities, environmental authorities, planning authorities, or tourism boards. So, and then the second class of stakeholders are indigenous people and local communities. So these are people which use these areas, and they use these areas and sort of in a balanced and sustainable way, but they are dependent on these areas. And then scientific institutions and individuals like museums, universities, and research centers, academics or researchers who focus or talk about cultural heritage. Then regional institutions, if they have a religious value associated to it, NGOs, national, regional, and local level. So NGOs are also involved in issues related to cultural heritage. And then also international organizations who look after the cultural heritage of the entire world, like UNESCO, ICOMOS, IUCN. So these are the different stakeholders who have a shared responsibility towards maintaining the cultural heritage, and whose interests are also affected by any change in cultural heritage. So these are the different types of stakeholders. And then we looked up at doing a baseline study for cultural heritage assessment. So the purpose of doing a baseline study is to identify and describe the nature and location and assess the value or importance of the cultural heritage assets which are likely to be affected directly or indirectly by the development project. And you can use different types of data collection methods. So you can have desk-based studies, you can have interviews with concerned authorities and affected communities, interviews with local people, specialists with local knowledge, ethnographic studies, gathering of oral tradition information, field surveys, building surveys, specialized surveys for underwater areas if your site is in a underwater area. So these are the different sort of data collection methods you can use for doing cultural heritage studies. And then for sources of desk-based studies, you can look up at international, national, provincial, or local databases. So the stakeholders which we talked about have certain data or certain archives which you can access to get information relating to your particular area. Then you can look up at the old maps which are available of your site or your larger district community areas. You can use aerial photographs, satellite imagery, old and recent. So if you have ever used Google Map, you can change the year to a past year, and you can see the change in the photograph as seen from the satellite data. So that is another source of desktop study. And photographs, old photographs, books, newspapers, pamphlets, scientific articles, reports, which which were in the past or which are in the present. You can look up at those. You can look up at estate records, old plans. So all of these are sources of desktop study, but you need to search for these sources and know the right reference of where you will find these sources. So this is for a desk-based study. And then for field surveys, you can use geophysical techniques like resistivity survey, which measures the ground resistance to electric current. Then magnetometer survey, which measures the magnetic properties of soil and is used to identify locations of past human activities. Then you also have field walking, where you can, which is also known as surface artifact collection, and this allows to collect and plot material on the location. Field walking is rapid and economical. Then you also have augering, which is most frequently used in river valley systems, where deposition has covered the land surface. So, and in the process, the soil sequence is recorded through auger holes and maps are prepared. So you basically take out the soil from a depth, and then you assess the soil to see the uh, the soil composition, to look up at how in the past the soil was different. And then you also have test pitting, where you do hand excavations by creating small pits of plant sizes, and then you analyze different artifacts, artifact recovery rate over the area, including the date, location, and extent of the surveyed site. Then you also have earthwork surveys, which provide useful information on the form and condition of the earthwork, and they're extremely good at identifying the chronological relationships of the elements of the landscape to one another. And the essence of analytical earthwork survey is to measure the process, to examine the slopes and other features, their flows and patterns, and to examine the relationships and compare them with different examples. Then you can also use drones to provide for recording historical buildings, monuments, archaeological sites, and landscapes. And you can include different type of sensors in your drones. So you can include sensors like thermal imaging sensor, which senses the temperatures of the surfaces from outside. You can include camera, multi-hyperspectral imaging units, laser scanners. And then if you're doing surveys in lakes, rivers, lakes, or other marine environment, you can use underwater surveys, where you can use multi-beam sonar, magnetometry, and other things. Observations by divers who go into see the sort of geographical features which are present and things like that. And then you sort of assign value to culture heritage resources. So this is again done based on a scale of very high to uh, negligible or unknown. So this is basically so very high is when the assets or things which you find in your baseline study is of very high importance, or is acknowledged by an international committee, or is acknowledged internationally through references or archives, and they contribute significantly to acknowledge international research objectives. So high is uh, when the observations you make are important at a national and at a national level. Medium is when it's at a regional importance level. Low is when it is of limited value, possibly limited to the community itself. Negligible is when you find no, very little or no cultural heritage relationship. And unknown is when you can ascertain the value of the resource based on the cultural heritage. But that is, you don't have enough documentation to prove that it has any significant value. And then the methodology for assessing the value of assets of cultural heritage. So the value of heritage is assessed in relation to the statutory designations, international or national, priorities or recommendations which are set out in national research agendas and prescribed values. These are basically official national and international documents. The professional judgment is often used to determine importance of resources. So expert consultations can be used, and this method is used objectively as possible. Qualitative assessment using professional judgment is inevitably involved. So in the first stage, you sort of assess the cultural value based on the desk-based studies, and then you involve a professional to basically say that the judgment you have made is right. And then critical cultural heritage is basically internationally recognized heritage of communities who use or have used within living memory the cultural heritage for long-standing cultural purposes. And these are legally protected cultural heritage areas, including those proposed by host governments for such designations. So even today, there are certain communities which live far inwards in landscapes which are not accessible to anyone outside their community. So they have a sort of a cultural heritage which is associated with that community, and this is also recognized by the international cultural committees as well as the governments of the regions in which they live. So those are basically critical cultural heritage. And then for cultural heritage, we then do impact prediction and evaluation. So potential sources of impacts includes large-scale developments like building of roads, bridges, tall buildings, uh, inappropriate, acontextual, or insensitive developments which do not have anything to do with the cultural value of the site, any sort of renewable demolitions or new infrastructure typologies. We also have impacts from the change in land use policy, from large-scale urban frameworks. Excessive or inappropriate tourism also causes problems and impacts to sites. So these are potential sources of impacts to cultural heritage. And sectors also particularly contribute towards affecting cultural heritage. So these sectors includes energy, which requires construction of gas pipelines, utility lines, and things, pollution from these sources. Then we also have communications like laying of cables, fiber optics, telephone lines, uh, and other things. And you have transport, where you have construction of very linear roads, highways, extensions, and other things. And of course, you need to have transportation to these sites as well. So you have to be very sensitive towards planning if you have projects like these. Then around water, we have dams, irrigation, and drainage schemes. Sewage and sanitation is also a particular sector which affects cultural heritage. Urban development, industry, mining, agriculture, and forestry. And then in terms of intangible cultural heritage impacts, uh, so these have effects on the continued use of biological resources or access to traditional site. They also have effects in terms of the respect, preservation, protection, and maintenance of traditional knowledge systems, innovations, and their practices. Uh, then you also have sacred sites and associated rituals or ceremonial activities. There are also effects on exercise or customary laws. There's also a sort of negative perception by people towards the cultural heritage or critical cultural heritage, and there's not enough respect towards the cultural heritage of a different community compared to your own community. So that is also an impact. And then we need to do identification of activities which are associated with the project, which can cause cultural heritage dissemination or disintegration. So these includes land take or land use, the amount of excavation which the development is going to require, construction methods and programming which are going to be used, the details of temporary and permanent works, the predicted traffic flow volumes during both the construction and operation phase, building layout and height in terms of visual and integrity effects. So you need to identify the activities which are going to cause changes in cultural heritage. And then you also need to look up at the magnitude of the impact of these activities. So these can be positive or negative. They can have direct or indirect effects. They can have permanent or temporary effects, irreversible, reversible impacts. They can be short term, medium term, long term, or they can be cumulative effects where two or more effects come together to act on the cultural heritage aspect of the site. And so cumulative effects occur when one project has multiple effects on the same resource and more than one project affects the cultural heritage in an area. And the proposed project will then increase the existing pressures which cultural heritage is facing because of other projects in the near vicinity of the project location. And so that was all in terms of cultural heritage. And then we looked up at lecture 48, which was on EIA methods for health. So we looked up at the beginning of human health risk assessment. So human health risk assessment is the likelihood that a given exposure or series of exposures may have damaged or will damage the health of individuals. And this is the human health assessment, risk assessment is the process to estimate the nature and probability of adverse human effects in humans who may be exposed to chemicals and contaminated environmental media now or in the future. So anything which affects the health of the humans present on your site. So you also need to do a human health risk assessment uh, in your EIA. And it has 4 steps. So the first step is hazard identification. If you're dealing or using any sort of chemicals which are harmful to human health, you need to identify them as hazards. And the second step is dose response assessment, which is how much quantity of the chemicals or in terms of how much exposure uh, how much exposure to chemicals would the humans be exposed to, that is the workers who are using them as well as anyone else who's working on a different activity at the same time on the site. In the future, if they are going to be there are going to be consequences because of the use of the chemical and things, so you need to look up at the dose response assessment. The third is exposure assessment, and the fourth is risk characterization, where you identify the risk again in a magnitude of scale. These are the 4 steps for doing the human health risk assessment. And the process of undertaking health impact assessment is first is screening. So you need to carry out screening and how to carry out that screening. So it includes contacting stakeholders, decision makers, identifying resources, and also looking up at policy program development of the overall project. Then the second step is scoping, that is, what is the geographical boundary of doing the health impact assessment? What is the time frame for health impact assessment? What skills are required by the health impact assessment team? And then you define goals, use the local data, expert opinion to come up with all of these information. And then the third step is appraisal, where you look up at any policies which can impact the health outcomes, and if there are health inequalities which will be present on site, and if the project impacts to health are likely to be significant in terms of the number of individuals impacted, in terms of the magnitude of risk, and the immediate requirement for relief. And if you have enough methods, expertise, evidence available to document all of these changes, um, so then in the appraisal state itself, you sort of review secondary data which is available. You do surveys, interviews, and focus group discussions. You do field observations, statistical analysis or GIS mapping to interpret the analysis of data collection, identify evidence-based mitigations and recommendations, and you report them in your health impact assessment report. And then the last step is monitoring. So what needs to be monitored after the proposal is implemented, and if there are particular aspects which require careful consideration in case of early intervention, and did the policy decision change in a way that was consistent with the recommendations of the health impact assessment. And then you communicate these health impact findings and identify goals for the monitoring process. This is the health impact process, assessment process. And we also looked up at definitions and concepts relating to health. So, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well being. And this is not merely an absence of any disease, but this is when you have a complete balance between your physical, mental, and social aspects of your well being. And then the model of health determinants include age, sex, and hereditary factors, the individual lifestyle factors, social and community influences, living and working conditions, the general socioeconomic, cultural, environment conditions. All of these play a role in our health, um, in the health of any person. All of these are factors which affect the health of an individual. And factors which need to be considered in EIA relating to health or health outcomes. So, any sort of specific type of illness, conditions such as infectious diseases, chronic diseases, injuries, nutrition related conditions, and mental well being. These are health outcomes. Health determinants are anything which sort of restricts individuals to reach uh, healthy status, so influence the experience of health in affected communities. And so we also have this overlap and integration among the different environmental impact assessment studies. So approaches which involve health impact assessment practically into the practice of EIA. So we can use inclusion as secondary effects, metrics which is embedded in each chapter. We have summary of all health concerns in different chapters. Then we should also have standalone HIA technical report and HIA presented as one chapter in EIA. So health basically is used in all of the chapters of EIA which we have discussed so far, and you can map all of the health outcomes and health determinants which a particular activity or project dimension have in any of the previous chapters. And then you have this matrix which can be placed in all of these at the end of the chapter in a summary form. And then also you can have a standalone HIA report or have a separate chapter on HIA in your overall EIA report. And then we also looked at the concept of inside the fence and outside the fence. So inside the fence is within the project boundary, and outside the fence is when you have health impacts on populations who live, work, or play in communities near to or potentially affected by the project. So this is inside and outside the fence. Then we already looked up at the HIA process previously. So after the assessment, you have to do mitigation enhancement, wherein you define or develop strategies to minimize the health harms and maximize health benefits. And then the last step is obviously monitoring, where you see how effective your HIA is, and then you track changes over time. And so in the screening and scoping for HIA, you need to collect information relating to the demographic of the community, the information on health outcomes, health-related behaviors of the community, the information on social, environmental, or institutional health determinants. Okay, let's get this. And then, so there's a distinction between doing a baseline study and a community profile. So a community profile is intended to create an overall picture of the community health to help understand the health context of the affected population. And the baseline is intended to collect a limited set of replicable data indicators that will be monitored over time to identify change related to specific project or policy. So this is the difference between the baseline study and a community profile, because we develop a community profile in health impact assessment. Uh, and then in terms of assessing the effects, you can look up at increase in exposure to contaminants, decreases in the substance and food sources, increase in sexually transmitted infections due to presence of mobile workforces. So these are just examples of adverse health effects. And then for mitigations or enhancements, they can be in terms of management plans, worker policies, recommendations for working with external agencies, and other things. So these are the different types of mitigation uh, mitigation efforts which you can propose in your HIA reports. And then there's also mitigation hierarchy. So there's an order to addressing the impacts. So the first step should be to avoid the impact altogether. So prevention is better than cure. So that is the literal translation to of the first step. That is to avoid any impact on health. The second is to minimize the impact if you cannot avoid the impact. The third is to repair the adverse consequences of the impact. And the fourth is to compensate people for impacts which cannot be avoided or mitigated. So this is the mitigation hierarchy. And then, so the purpose of doing the human health risk assessment is to assess the potential for human exposure to environmentally mediated chemical contaminants. And this is also to predict the change in health risk that could occur in development projects. We looked up at the we looked up at the steps modeling approach previously as well. So the first is hazard identification, second is dose response assessment, third is exposure assessment, and fourth is risk characterization. And so this was from lecture 48. So moving on to lecture 49. Lecture 49 and lecture 50 are both on AIA methods around socioeconomic impacts or SIA. And they are divided into part 1 and part 2. So in lecture 49, we looked up at the definition and concept of social impact assessment. So social impact assessment or SIA is defined as estimating and appraising the conditions of a society organized and changed by large-scale application of high technology. It is also the consequence to human population of any public or private action that alters the way in which people live, work, play, relate to one another, organized to meet their needs and generally cope as a member of society. We have more definitions on SIA. So there is, it's also defined as systematic advanced appraisal of the impacts on the day-to-day quality of life of people and communities when the environment is affected by development or policy change. And then the guidance for assessing and managing the social impacts of project IAIA 2015 also defines social impact assessment as the process of analyzing, monitoring, and managing the intended and unintended social consequences, which can be both positive and negative, of planned interventions in terms of policies, programs, plans, projects, and uh, any social change processes involved by those interventions. Its primary purpose is to bring about a more sustainable and equitable biophysical and human environment. So basically, anything which affects the social functioning of the community is defined as socioeconomic, social impact assessment. And then in social impact assessment, we also do the scoping and baseline studies. So the IAIA guidance considers that social impacts includes all issues which are associated with the planned interventions. That is a project which can affect or concern people, whether directly or indirectly. The social impact can be considered as either perceptual, cognitive, or corporal, which is bodily or physical at any level. And for example, the level of an individual person, an economic unit, a social group, a workplace, or a community society. So the level can be just an individual person or a family or a household, a group of friends, a workspace setting, or a community or society altogether. So you can do it in different levels as well. And then in the scoping, you need to ask questions to clarify the type, duration, the spatial extent, and distribution of impacts. So you need to ask questions as to what to include, what sort of effects to include, what is the period of time for the study, what is the area over which you're going to study this, and what sort of and whom are these impacts being studied on, that is the level of the study. And so what to include in terms of impact is direct economic impact if any sort of action is causing the loss of livelihood or the change in livelihood, amount, then you need to include that impact. If it's an indirect or wider economic or expenditure impact, if it's a demographic impact, housing impact, whether the project is causing displacement and things like that, um, land use change, etc. Other local services, socio-cultural, if the impact is affecting the if the impact is affecting the cultural aspect of the study area, then you also need to include that and the distributional effects as well. So examples of social differences which may be environmentally significant. So you have communities like diverse group of people. Then you also need to consider the ethnic or tribal groups. You also need to consider occupational groups or different types of people in terms of grouped in terms of their occupations. Then you also need to consider the socioeconomic groups in terms of the level of income, uh, the age and gender as well. And the other dimensions of impact includes adverse or beneficial impacts, reversible, irreversible, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, whether it's actual or perceived. So you need to include these dimensions as well when you do your impact assessment. And so impact prediction and evaluation. So there are key direct and indirect employment impact questions. So you need to look up at the kind and number of jobs, the local people, if you have in migrant population or workers, you need to account for that as well. What is the magnitude of the direct or indirect effects in terms of employment resulting from a project development, and what proportion of these jobs will be filled by the local workers, that is the workers which are near to the project site, and how will local businesses be affected by the development of this project, and will the development provide opportunities for expansion, or for local firms will experience difficulty in competing because a new major uh, player will come into play. So you need to consider all of these impacts relating to employment and economic sense. And then in terms of measuring the wider economic impacts, we have the multiplier approach. And we use three types of methods. We have the economic based multiplier model, the input output model, and the Keynesian multiplier. So the economic based multipliers based on the division of local economies into basic and non-basic activities. So basic activities include the local regional supportive activities, which can be seen as the drivers of the economy in that area. Then we also then the non-basic activities includes regional or regional dependent activities. So these are what supports the population, which are associated with the basic activities like the retail services. And then you consider the ratio of basic to non-basic activities for measuring the employment in terms of the employment numbers for making predictions. So if you have an X increase in basic employment, it may generate a Y increase in non-basic employment. So again, this is just a very raw method of making assumptions, but you basically use basic and non-basic activities to determine how the project will change this economic um, division of the society based on the present numbers. And then we have the Keynesian multiplier, which is a money injection into an economic system where the national or regional will cause an increase in the level of income in that system by some multiple of the original injection. So it's basically considering the new development as a money injection or an activity which is going to bring in money. So you basically multiply uh, so KR is the regional income multiplier, whereas J is the initial income injection or the multiplicand. So J is basically determined by the new project, and YR is the change in the level of income in the region. So basically multiply the initial injection factor by the regional income multiplier. Again, you can calculate all of these. There were further equations to this, which you can refer back to the lecture 49. So it basically considers the new development as a money injection and multiplies it to the existing income of the region. And then and then we looked up at the stakeholders identification in terms of economic impact. So you need to look at people who are living in the surrounding areas whose livelihood may be affected because of the new project coming up. You need to look up at construction workers who will migrate into this area for during the development or construction phase. The people who are living near the migrant construction workers will reside. You need to look up at their sentiments as well, plus a whole range of agencies and developer and supply chain links. So you need to consider all of these people in your calculations. And okay, then we also looked up at the demographic impact, which is the dependence on project-related changes in population with relation to the existing population size and the structure in the impact area. And we also looked up at what sort of necessary actions are taken to establish existing population baseline in the impact area, and the most useful source of population data is the national census. So you can use national census for doing a demographic analysis of the population and the changes in the population because of the new development project. So then population projections and forecast are produced by the national local authorities, and projections for smaller areas are tend to be less reliable than for larger areas because of uh, the numbers not being present in the census reliably. And then net migration is also an important factor which needs to be considered in the demographic analysis. Migration flows are difficult to predict. Uh, then we also need to look up at social cohesion. So social cohesion is basically people's sense of belonging to a community and their satisfaction with life in the community, whether or not the community is considered as a social asset. So, in a cohesive society or a community, a network of positive relationships is generated and maintained. That is, there's a level of community pride. The profiling of social cohesion is challenging. Data is often limited, but it may include factors such as relative well being and deprivation. Another key factor is the sense of personal safety and fear of crime. Also, when a new development project or new construction activity starts happening in a area, the general happiness of the people or the general uh, association of people with the construction activity is negative usually. So maintaining a social cohesion positively with the community is important and needs to be included in the social impact assessment. Then we also had this structure of global multi-poverty index, which looks up at three dimensions, basically education, health, and standard of living. So in education, we look up at years of schooling, and the school of attendance. In health, we look up at child mortality rates and nutrition levels. In standard of living, we look up at electricity, sanitation, water, floor, cooking fuel, and other assets. So this is also used to determine the global poverty index. And in the SIA, we also need to determine the population changes, which is the total number of employees moving into the impact area during both construction and operational stages of the development. How much of these employees are migrant populations, whether they are bringing their family members, what is the characteristics of these families, how it will affect the existing population, which is already living in and around the project site, and their perceptions and feelings about the project as well. So the significance of population changes is to look up at the existing population size and structure in the impact area, the geographical distribution of the immigration population and the timing of the population change, whether it will be for the project duration itself or whether they will settle after the project is completed. Okay. Then we also had the gravity model approach, which was again calculating the number of employees moving into a particular settlement and considering them as a positive function of the settlement size and a negative function of its distance from the project site. So this is again another calculation based formula. And So we also looked up at accommodation requirements and its significance. So we already have the local population, which can either have a housing deficit or which has future housing needs, and these can be permanent. Then we also have the incoming population, which will require housing needs, whether at a operation stage or at a construction stage, whether it can be temporary or permanent, and how it will how the local capacity can be met using temporary and sharing facilities, how it's going to impact tourist accommodation and other things. So all of these things are connected, and these impacts also need to be put in the social impact assessment in terms of education, in terms of accommodation and education as well. And educational impacts include, so you have an incoming population, and you have they bring their families and they have children in these particular ages. Then they also have the need for schooling at nursery level, school level, or just as uh, creche services. So these are also things which will affect. So education and accommodation impacts also need to be included in the social impact assessments. And other social impacts includes displacement and resettlement. So we have social impacts from displacement of host population, with the population forced to move out from their roots. And physical displacement refers to loss of housing resulting from project-related acquisition of land and or restrictions on land use that require the affected persons to move to another location. And then the economic displacement refers to situations where people's houses are not directly affected, but there's a loss of their other assets or access to assets. That is, their agricultural land is being taken up and the economic livelihood is disrupted. And there's an associated loss of income. So these are the other social impacts which needs to be considered and documented in the SIA. Then for mitigation and enhancement, we have the community benefits agreement, which is so the type of benefits include financial incentives. So you can have monetary agreements, which includes payment towards physical displacement or economic displacement in terms of annual payments or lump sum amount or both. And then you also have social benefit measures in kind, which include additional transport improvements, affordable housing, village halls, sports facilities, improved telecoms and training services. So where the developer promises some sort of social benefit for the entire community which is affected. So these are certain mitigation and enhancements. Then we also have uh, uh, so the IA also uh, has 6 ways in which a community can contribute towards contribute to local benefits to a host community, and these include social investment funding, where you fund social projects like village halls and other things. Then you have local content, especially employment in terms of the labor forces being employed from the community itself. Then you have shared infrastructure, capacity building, supporting community initiatives, and payout of royalties to local landowners or local authorities, wherein you give a sum of uh, where you given a percentage of your profits from the new development towards the local landowners or the local authorities on whose land you built the new development. Okay. And then we also have the social impact management plan. So these are basically done to establish roles and responsibilities of the different proponents, government stakeholders, and communities in mitigating and managing the social impacts and opportunities of major resource development projects. So to establish who is going to do what, and that all of the stakeholders in a project are involved in the development, design, and planning. Okay, so that was all which was discussed in this week's content. So we will now look up at the questions from the previous run of the course, and you can post your answers in the chat box. I will keep moderating the chat box. Okay. So the first question is a straight true or false. The European Landscape Convention defines landscape as a zone or area as perceived by local people or visitors whose visual features and character are the result of the action of natural and or cultural, that is human factors. So is the statement true or false? So you can post your answers in the chat box. So this is again based on the definition of landscape which we looked up in the initial slides. Okay, so the correct answer is true. This is the actual definition of landscape as defined by the European Landscape Convention in the year 2000. So moving on to question 2, state true or false. The term zone of theoretical visibility or ZTV is used to describe the area over which a development can theoretically be seen and is usually computer generated using a digital terrain model DTM or digital surface model DSM. So is this statement true or false? Okay, so the statement is also true. The zone of theoretical visibility is used to describe the area over which a development can theoretically be seen. And we use the digital terrain model, which is a 3D computer model of the Earth's surface without any surface objects. And the DSM, which is a digital surface model, is a computer generated model that represents the surface heights, including the trees and buildings. So the correct answer was A, true. So moving on to question 3. A measure of the physical states of the landscape, which may include the extent to which typical characters represented in individual areas, the intactness of the landscape and the condition of individual elements is called A. Landscape character, B. Landscape quality, C. Landscape value, and D. Visual amenity. So, which term is the correct definition as described in the question? Okay, so the correct answer is B. Landscape quality. So the correct definition was for the landscape quality. So moving on to question 4, identify the following factors that contribute to the landscape. 1. Geology, 2. Land ownership, 3. Smells, and 4. Memories. So you need to identify the options which has the correct uh, factors. So we had 3 categories of factors which contribute to landscape, including natural, cultural or social, and perception and aesthetic. Okay, so the correct answer is D. That is, all 4 of the options are correct. So geology is a natural factor, land ownership is a cultural or social factor, and smells and memories is a perceptual and aesthetic factor that contributes to the landscape. So the correct answer was D. That is, all 4 of the options were correct. So moving on to question 5. Match the following terms of group A with a description in group B. So we have the different field-based survey techniques and their description in group B relating to cultural heritage. So you need to match the terms of group A with their description in group B. Okay, so the correct answer is C, that is test pitting involves the hand excavation of of an array of small pits of a predetermined size and provides a clear picture of the nature of the soil structure and the upper layers of the underlying geology. So P matches with 2. Then earthwork surveys can be used for archaeological sites that are visible, such as banks, ditches, burial mounds, sites of deserted or shrunken settlements. So Q matches with 1. Then finds is usually for recovered artifacts. So R matches with 4. And machine trenching employs trenches usually cut with a toothless ditching bucket laid out in a pattern across the site. So S matches with 3. So the correct option was C, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 1, R matches with 4, and S matches with 3. So moving on to question 6. As identified by ICOMOS 2011, potential sources of impact to cultural heritage include the following. 1. Large-scale development. 2. Land use policy change. 3. Large-scale urban frameworks. And 4. Excessive or inappropriate tourism. So you need to select all of the options which are correct from A, B, C, D. Okay, so the correct answer is D. That is all of the 4 uh, options were potential sources of impact to cultural heritage as defined by the ICOMOS in 2011. So D is the correct answer. So moving on to question 7, the purpose of baseline study on cultural heritage includes the following. First, to identify, describe the nature and location and assess the value or importance of the cultural heritage assets likely to be affected by the development project. 2, to comply with the TOR for EIA. 3, to alignment with regulation. And 4, planning and management of data and assessment work. So again, you need to select all of the options which are correct. Okay, so the correct answer is D again. That is all 4 of the options are used for doing the baseline study on cultural heritage. Okay, so moving on to question 8. So this is state true or false. So health impact assessment or HIA looks at the potential effects of a project outside the fence, that is on population who live, work or play in communities near to and potentially affected by the project. So is the statement A true or B false? Okay, we discussed this in the lecture 48 on AIA methods for health. So we had 2 categories, which was inside the fence and outside the fence. So outside the fence is uh, defined as populations who live, work, or play in communities near to and potentially affected by the project. So the statement was true. So A is the correct answer. So moving on to question 9, again based on human health risk assessment or HHRA, is the process to estimate the nature and probability of adverse health effects in humans who may be exposed to chemicals and contaminated environmental media now or in the future. So is the statement true or false? Okay, so the correct answer is true. The human health risk assessment is the process to estimate the nature and probability of adverse health effects in humans who may be exposed to chemicals and contaminated environmental media now or in the future. So A was the correct answer. So moving on to question 10, identify the steps of human health risk assessment or HHRA from the following. First is hazard identification. 2 is dose response assessment. 3 is exposure assessment. And 4 is risk characterization. We need to identify the steps for human health risk assessment. Okay, so the correct answer is D. That is all four of the listed steps are steps in the human health risk assessment in the order of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the correct answer was D. Okay, moving on to question 11. Select the preferred order of addressing potential impacts in EIA as stated by mitigation hierarchy. So we have four options, which is minimize the impact, avoid the impact, repair the adverse consequence of impact, compensate people for impacts that cannot be avoided or mitigated, and you need to arrange them in the mitigation hierarchy or in the order from ascending from step 1 to step 4. Okay, so the correct answer is C. That is the mitigation hierarchy in terms of preferred order of addressing the potential impacts is first is to avoid the impact altogether. That is, prevention is better than cure. So first step is to avoid the impact altogether. The second step is to minimize the impact if the impact cannot be avoided. Then the third step is to repair the adverse consequences of impact or to deal with the adverse effects of the impact first. And then fourth is to compensate people for impacts which cannot be avoided or mitigated in terms of monetary value or in terms of certain benefits. So the correct order was given in option C. Okay, so moving on to question 12. Again, according to the Inter-Organizational Committee on Guidelines and Principles for Social Impact Assessment, Socioeconomic Impact Assessment or SIA is the consequences to human population of any public or private actions that alter the way in which people live, work, play, relate to one another, organize to meet their needs, and generally cope as members of society. Is the statement true or false? So again, this is based on the definition of social impact, socioeconomic impact assessment by the Inter-Organization Committee on Guidelines and Principles for Social Impact Assessment. So again, uh, definitions and descriptions of terms are important. So please remember the definitions or have an understanding of what the definition means to answer questions relating to definitions. Okay, so in this case, the statement is true. This is the definition as described by the Inter-Organization Committee on Guidelines and Principles for Socioeconomic Assessment in 1994 for social impact assessment. So the statement is true. So moving on to question 13. Key social differences provided by World Bank 1991, which are significant from EIA perspective, include the following. 1, communities, that is diverse group of people. 2, ethnic or tribal groups. 3, occupational groups. And 4, socioeconomic groups. They need to answer with the option which includes the correct options. Okay, so the correct answer was C. That is all. 4 of these are examples of social differences which may be environmentally significant, as provided by the World Bank of 1991. There is another option which is age and gender, which is not included in the options. Okay, so moving on to question 14. The prediction of socioeconomic impacts include following approaches: extrapolative methods, normative methods, cause-effect relationships between the variables involved, or D, all of the above. Okay, so the correct answer is D, all of the above. So all of these methods are used for predicting the socioeconomic impacts. So moving on to question 15. For measuring the wider economic impacts, that is the multiplier approach, following methods are used. A economic based multiplier model, B input output model, C Keynesian multiplier, or D all of the above. So we talked about these in the lecture on social impact assessment, where we looked up at the three methods for the multiplier approach for measuring the economic impacts. Okay, so the correct answer is D. That is, the three methods which are most frequently used are the economic-based multiplier model, the input-output model, and the Keynesian multiplier. So D, all of the above is the correct answer. So moving on to question 16, the structure of global multi-poverty index includes three following dimensions. One, education, two, health, three, standard of living, and fourth, social inequality. So which of the following dimensions are correct from the given options from A to D? Okay, so we looked up at the global multi-poverty index, and it has three dimensions. That is the education, health, and standard of living. So the correct answer is A. That is 1, 2, and 3 only. Okay, moving on to question 17. State true or false. The gravity model approach is that the number of employees moving into a particular settlement would be a positive function of that settlement size and a negative function of its distance from the project site. Is this statement true or false? So again, formulas and their calculations are important. And approaches if they have any mathematical formulation as well. So the gravity model actually has the uh, describes the relation for the number of employees moving into a particular settlement as a positive function of the settlement size and a negative function from its distance from the project site. The statement was true. So moving on to question 18, which is match the following terms of group A with their description given in group B. So we have group A has social cohesion and local services, and group B have descriptions. So again, these are terms from the social impact assessment lectures. That is lecture 49 and 50. Okay, so the correct answer is B, that is social cohesion refers to the people's sense of belonging to a community, their satisfaction with life in the community, and whether or not the community is considered as a social asset. So P matches with true, and local services includes in-migration employees and their families, placing demand on a wide range of services, including education, health, recreation, police, fire, and social services. So Q matches with 1. So the correct answer is B, that is P matches with 2 and Q matches with 1. So moving on to question 19, state true or false. The economic displacement refers to situations where people's houses are not directly affected, but where there's a loss of other assets or access to assets that will result in a disruption of livelihoods and associated loss of income. Is the statement true or false? So we looked up at physical displacement and economic displacement in the social impact assessment. So again, this is based on the definition of economic displacement. Again, highlighting that definitions are critical and important from an examination's point of view. Okay, so the correct answer is A, that is the given definition for economic displacement is true. So the correct option is A, true. So if you have any queries, you can unmute yourself and ask now, and then we will proceed with week 10 assignment. Okay, so we can proceed with week 10 assignment as the deadline for the same has passed. So, question one is state true or false. As per the European Landscape Convention, the landscape includes rural areas, urban townscapes, and marine seascapes. So, is the statement true or false? Okay, so as per the definition of landscape, it is defined as a zone or area as perceived by local people or visitors, whose visual features and characters are the result of actions of natural or cultural, that is human factors. So rural areas are natural settings, urban townscapes are human-based constructions, but they have very significant characteristics, and marine seascapes so again have significant characteristics. So these are all examples of landscapes. So the statement was true. So the correct answer is A. So moving on to question 2, match the terms given in group A with group B. So we have the three categories of factors of landscape, that is natural, perception and aesthetic, and cultural or social in group A, and the factors under each of these categories in group B. So you need to match group A with group B. Okay, so the correct answer is that the natural factors of landscape include air, climate, hydrology, and land cover. So P matches with 2. The perceptual and aesthetic factors of landscape match with touch or feel, preference, associations, memories. So Q matches with 3, and cultural or social factors of landscape include land ownership and settlements. So R matches with 1. So the correct answer is D, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 4. Okay, so moving on to question 3. Match the terms given in Group A with Group B based on the corporate report on national character area profiles. So we have coherence, stewardship, disturbance, and historicity in Group A, and their character area profiles in Group B. Okay, so the correct answer is coherence is around the spatial arrangement of vegetation. So P matches with 2. Stewardship looks at the level of management for vegetation. So Q matches with 1. Disturbance looks up at the visual impacts of disturbance. So R matches with 4. And historicity matches with 3, which is vegetation with continuity. So the correct answer is A, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 1, and R matches with 4, and S matches with 3. Okay, so moving on to question 4. What term describes the area which can potentially be affected by the development of a project, which is based on methods of environmental and social impact assessment, landscape and visual, Rebecca Knight and Ricky Therrell 2018 book. So the options are zone of theoretical visibility, B zone of landscape development, C zone of theoretical development, and D zone of landscape visibility. Again, we looked up at this in the module on lecture 46, which was on landscape methods. So the correct answer is A, zone of theoretical visibility. Okay, so moving on to question 5. You need to match the scale of change of landscape given in group A with the definition in group B. So we have the scale of change for large, medium, small, imperceptible or no change, and its definition group B. So you need to match group A with group B. Okay, so the correct answer is uh, so a large scale of change has an obvious change in landscape elements, character, and quality of the landscape. So medium scale of change has a discernible change in landscape elements, character, and quality of landscape. So Q matches with 3. A small scale of change has a minor change in landscape elements, character, and quality of the landscape. So R matches with 1. And imperceptible or no change has no perceptible change in landscape elements, character, and quality of the landscape. So S matches with 2. So the correct answer is C, that is P matches with 4. And false. Okay, so we looked up at this in the purpose for doing a historic heritage and impact assessment, culture heritage assessment, and so this statement is true. The purpose of doing historical and physical assessment is to allow appropriate mitigation and investment. Moving on to question 7. The image below is an example of a historical or cultural landscape from which country? So the options are Peru, B, Italy, C, Spain, and D, Greece. Okay, so the correct answer is B, Italy. So this is a historical or cultural landscape of the country of Italy. So moving on to question 8, which is a match the field survey techniques given in A with their purposes in group B. Okay, so the correct answer is D, that is resistivity survey. Matches is used for measuring the ground resistance to the progress of an electrical current. That is, changes in resistance indicate the nature and location of varied features. Uh, so P matches with 3. Then magnetometer survey measures the magnetic properties of the soil and is used to identify locations of past human activity, that is periods of burning or hunting. So Q matches with 4. And then augering is most frequently used in river valleys where deposition has covered the land surface. So R matches with 2. And then test pitting is the hand excavation by creating small bits of plant sizes. So S matches with 1. So the correct answer is D, that is P matches with 3, Q matches with 4, R matches with 2, and S matches with 1. So moving on to question 9, what is the correct order of steps involved in human risk assessment by planning and scoping? So there was a query regarding this question as well. So the correct order should have been 1, hazard identification. Then the second step is, according to the options, is 3, dose response assessment. Then the third option is the exposure assessment, which is option 2. And the fourth step is risk characterization, which is option 4. So the correct option is none of the given options. So this has been communicated to the NPTEL team as well, and the associated marks for the same will be updated. So I hope that answers the queries. So moving on to question 10, state true or false. One of the benefits of composing a chapter on HIA within the AIA report is that it also becomes part of the regulatory decision-making process. So the statement is true. So you can have a HIA or health impact assessment matrices as a summary in all of the other chapters on different components in the AIA report. But if you have a separate chapter on health impact assessment in the AIA report, You also have to make decisions and have regulations towards achieving the health impact mitigations or enhancements as promised in the EIA report. So that is one of the advantage of having a separate EIA chapter, HIA chapter and EIA report. So the statement was true. So moving on to question 11, match the project activity with potential positive community health outcomes. So we have different activities in group A, and in group B, we have health outcomes, which are positive. So the building or upgrading is associated with the building or upgrading clothes is associated with reduced fatalities and injuries due to accidents caused because of traffic movement. So P matches with 3. And then occupational health safety is associated with reduced rates of infectious diseases. That is, if you maintain occupational health safety, you reduce the risk of uh, infectious diseases, such as uh, if you have better occupational practices, like you do not allow the stagnation of water in the project site, it will not lead to uh, the generation of mosquitoes and dengue and things like that. So Q matches with 2. Then jobs and incomes is associated with multiple physical and mental well-being outcomes. So when people have jobs, secure jobs and secure source of income, they have physical and mental well-being. They do not have pressures about supporting themselves or supporting their families. So they have a balanced state of physical and mental well-being. So R matches with 1. So again, the option given in the answers was D, which is wrong. The correct option was C, that is P matches with 3, Q matches with 2, and R matches with 1. So this has again been communicated to the NPTEL team, and they will make the correct uh, answer in their calculations. So moving on to question 12, state true or false. Social impact assessment is the estimation and appraisal of the conditions of a society organized and changed as a consequence of a project. So this is again true, and this is based on the definition of Wolf 1974. So if you remember, we talked a lot about the impacts of population change because of migration of worker forces or people coming towards developing the project and the demands it puts on the local services. So you see that the statement was true, and this is the actual definition given for social impact assessment from one of the sources. So the correct option is A, true. So moving on to question 13, this is again a state true or false question. So social cohesion refers to people's sense of belonging to a community, their satisfaction with life in the community, and whether or not the community is considered a social asset. So is the statement true or false? Okay, so the statement is true, and this is the actual definition of social cohesion. That is, people have a sense of pride in and the sense of belonging to a community, and they're satisfied within the community, and they consider that community as a social asset. So the statement is true, and we talked about this in the social impact assessment lectures 49 and 50. So moving on to question 14, which among the following is a dimension of the Global Multi-Poverty Index? Again, from lecture 49 and 50 on social impact assessment. So the Global Multi-Poverty Index has 3 dimensions. One is health, the other is education, and the third is standard of living. So education is one of the options. So the correct option is D, that is education. Okay, so moving on to question 15, again state true or false. So physical displacement refers to the loss of housing resulting from the project-related acquisition of land and/or restrictions on land use that require the affected persons to move to another location. So is the statement true or false? So this is again based out of lectures 49 and 50. And based on the definition of physical displacement, we looked up at economic displacement as well, wherein there's a loss of income or livelihood because of acquisition of land. Okay, so this statement is also true. Physical displacement refers to the loss of housing resulting from project-related acquisition of land and restrictions on land use that require the affected persons to move to another location. So the correct answer is A, that is the statement is true. Okay, so if you have any queries, you can unmute yourself or ask now, or you can post your queries in the discussion forums for the NPTEL course. The presentation for the session will be uploaded in the Google Drive, and the link for the YouTube video will also be shared, so you can refer to this discussion again if you want to revise the concepts again or look up at a particular solution to an assignment question. Okay, please feel free to post your queries in the discussion forums because we regularly go through discussion forums and try to identify and use and address your queries in these problem solving sessions. Okay, if you do not have any queries, thank you so much for joining the Week 10 problem solving course for the NPTEL certification course on environmental impact assessment. And if you have any feedback, you can provide it in the feedback forms which are available for the problem solving sessions specifically. And thank you once again for joining this session. We have another session tomorrow from 4 to 6 for week 11 problem solving session. And the link to the YouTube video and the slides for this presentation will be made available to you. So thank you for joining and have a nice day. Okay, so I will close the session now.